You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson. Hi, everybody.
And surprise, we're going to talk about another spiritualist, actually two spiritualists, the Eerie Eddy brothers. There was quite a few during the Victorian era. We've presented several of them to you, some of them probably legitimate, other ones probably not so legitimate. That's up to you to decide as the listener, of course, but when we find them, we're going to present them to you. And I know we find them in a lot of different ways, don't we?
We do. You know what surprises me about these people is that they made such big news back then, and they were so controversial, but now nobody remembers them or nobody thinks about them. And we have to do a lot of research, and then we run across them and we go, who was this? And then we read this history and we go, oh my God.
Yeah. It's funny because you find, I found spiritualists listed in mediums in the newspapers, local newspapers, depending upon where I'm looking. Sometimes you find them in your old books.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it was a practice to archive and historically record the happenings of Victorian spiritualists, which I'm surprised no one's actually sat down and written a completely comprehensive almanac of all of them.
Well, actually, somebody has, and I have the books.
Well, they're never complete, though. You know what I mean? There's a lot more that's not in them.
Oh, that's for sure. I have a couple on 20th century spiritualists, and then there was an author named Zoller called The Book of the Spirits, where he talked about spiritualism from the 19th century, and then he interviewed some modern spiritualists, but I don't think it's a complete guide, as you said.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if someone sat down and their whole purpose was to write, a comprehensive, even short descriptions of each one and what they achieved and what they did and the controversies surrounding them. That would be an interesting book to have on hand just for a research book, I think.
I think so too, and I think the Spiritualist Church and actually Lily Dale would be their historians would be good people to work on something like that.
Mm-hmm. They may already have their own. It's just not public. We don't know.
Right. I'm sure they have a lot of information that we haven't seen or heard, but I would like it if they would make it more public.
Absolutely. Now, this story, the Eerie Eddy brothers, took place in Vermont, in a town called Chittenden. Now, according to newspaper and spiritualist accounts of 1874, some very strange things were happening on a small Vermont farm near the town of Chittenden. Allegedly, all manner of bizarre phenomena was said to be taking place in the home of William and Horatio Eddy, two middle-aged illiterate brothers, and their sister Mary. Now, the Eddys lived in an unkempt two-story building that was reported to be infested with supernatural beings of such numbers that have never been reported before or since. The events at the farm were said to be so powerful and so strange that people came from all over the world to witness them. spiritualists began calling Chittenden the spirit capital of the universe. It's funny that they mention people from all around the world came to this farm. If I recall, when we did this episode on the Bell Witch, didn't they have people come from all over just to?
They came from all over, yeah.
It reminds me of that a little bit.
If actual spiritualists came, then I think, in my opinion, the fact that they call the house unkempt, it was old and run down, and there must have been some incidents that happened there that made them travel. I mean, it must have been so strong that it made them actually travel to go see it.
And this just says people. It doesn't even specifically say just spiritualists came to the farm. It just says so strange that people came from all over the world to witness. So I'm sure spiritualists were the first in line because they're like, wow, this stuff happens. Let's go see it. Let's witness it for ourselves. And
right, exactly.
But we know, I mean, celebrity and the media, they all want to like check out. And obviously authors, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used to travel, and Houdini. All these people would travel to experience these things in person to see if they were actually real. That's
true. And spiritualism was so new back then that people were exploring it, and they were they're probably networking at the same time too.
And you got to think, if people were traveling from all over the world to witness this, back then it wasn't just let me hop on a plane, I'll be there in 5 hours.
Oh, no, they had to go out of their way.
I mean, we're talking a week to get there. We're talking, 4 or 5 days to get there. So
it wasn't travel mostly by train or by boat?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm thinking if this stuff was continual, it had to have been going on for a while. It wasn't just 1 or 2 quick occurrences and that's all. I mean, we're talking.
Think about it. You had to have the money to travel too.
Yeah. Well, which is why you always read about celebrities and authors and people in the business and spiritualists that travel to do this. So, yeah, I'm sure regular people would just be the locals, but exactly. Okay, so needless to say, not everyone was convinced of the legitimacy of the reported events on the Eddy farm, and one such man was a successful attorney named Henry Steele Olcott. Prior to hearing of the Eddy brothers, Olcott had no interest whatsoever in the burgeoning spiritualist movement. Now, however, one day as he returned to his office from lunch, he picked up a copy of the spiritualist newspaper, The Banner of Light. In the paper, he read a graphic account of the strange happenings that were being reported in Chittenden. It's unlikely at the time that Olcott had any idea how a simple newspaper article was going to change his life. Now, it's important that we establish the fact that Henry Olcott was not connected in any way to the spiritualist movement, nor was he a proponent of the paranormal. Now, what might have prompted him to pick up a copy of the Banner of Light that day is unknown. Olcott was born in New Jersey in 1832 and attended college in New York City, studying agricultural science. Now, while still in his early 20s, he received international recognition for his work on a model farm and for founding a school of agricultural students. Now, during this time, he published 3 scientific works, and he went on to become the editor for Horace Greeley's newspaper, the New York Tribune. Now, when the Civil War broke out, Olcott enlisted in the Union Army. He was appointed as a special investigator to root out corruption and fraud in the military arsenals and shipyards. He was soon promoted to the rank of colonel, and after the war was part of a 3-person panel that investigated the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, after the war, Olcott studied law and became a wealthy and successful attorney. So now, how would an agriculturist and military investigator go on to become the first American psychic researcher? That's the question.
After buying a copy of the spiritualist newspaper, Olcott read with interest the reports from the Eddy farm. And although he was skeptical, he knew that if the stories were true, that this was the most important fact in modern physical science. He later wrote about that. And a short time after reading the story, Colonel Olcott traveled to Vermont, accompanied by a newspaper artist named Alfred Capps. And together they planned to investigate the strange events at the Eddy farm and if the stories were actually a hoax. So they would expose the Eddy brothers in the Daily Graphic newspaper as nothing but charlatans. If the Eddys were true mediums, Olcott would announce the validity of spiritualism to the world. In either event, Olcott, he was very determined to be fair and open-minded in his judgments. So Olcott and Capes, he traveled to the secluded town of Chittenden, located within the Green Mountains. The trip out to the farm was uneventful, but the first meeting with the Eddy brothers was anything but ordinary. The two distant and unfriendly farmers were rough-hewn characters with dark hair and eyes, and New England accents that were so thick that the New York attorney and the writer could scarcely understand them. Now, I've heard New England accents, and I understand them, but maybe back then the accents were thicker.
They're pretty thick. If you've been up there traveling at all, there's some drawl and there's some lingo that's local. But I would imagine, like you said, back then it was probably even more so. And this was before a lot of other big cities and towns had influence over each other. So they were kind of isolated. So their dialect of that particular area probably was stronger.
Probably. And as you said, they were isolated. So Olcott would later learn that the brothers were descended from a long line of psychics. Mary Bradbury, a distant relative, had been convicted of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. She escaped the village with the help of friends. She was very lucky, actually. Their own grandmother had been blessed with the gift of second sight and often went into trances, speaking to entities that no one else could see. Their mother, Julia, had been known for frightening her neighbors with predictions and visions, although her husband, Zephaniah, unusual name, he condemned her powers. Zephaniah, yeah. He condemned her powers as the work of the devil. Julia quickly learned to hide her gifts from the cruel and abusive man. So he was very abusive. And
why would you marry someone who's abusive towards that if that's what you do? Maybe she didn't know she had the gifts at the time she married him. It's hard to say, I bet.
Either that or she didn't know he was abusive till after she married him. So that can happen too. Yeah. Yep. However, the supernatural couldn't have been hidden once the couple began having children. And there were strange poundings. It began shaking the house. There was disembodied voices. They were heard in empty rooms. And occasionally the children even vanished from their cribs, which I find, wow, okay. They were likely to be discovered anywhere in the house and even outside. As William and Horatio got older, their strange powers strengthened. On many occasions, Zephaniah would see the boys playing with unfamiliar children who would vanish whenever he approached. So when these visitors vanished, she would take the boys to the barn and beat them with a rawhide whip as punishment. The strange children returned again and again, earning the young Eddy boys countless beatings, and eventually they would grow to both fear and hate their father.
Yeah, I would hate my father too if the father's obviously seeing them too. So it's not like they're experiencing and lying. He's actually seeing them and probably questioning them, going, where did those kids go? Well, they're gone now. Well, wait, where did they go? And why are you lying to me? And what are you hiding? And let me beat you for it. And it happens over and over again. It's like, well, obviously, if the father can see it, the mother has abilities. It's no surprise then that the two sons have abilities.
Well, he sounds like an a-hole, and
yeah, that's
he sounds like an asshole. Let's just say the word. Let's just say the word as it is. He sounds like an asshole, and sometimes people do things out of fear, and he probably beat them out of fear, which is awful. Yeah.
Well, obviously he has an ability too, which he didn't understand. So obviously they're going to lash out.
He had it too because he saw them. That's true.
I'll pick up here. The boys soon learned they were unable to attend school. The initial attempts were marked by inexplicable happenings and disturbances as invisible hands threw books, levitated desks, and caused objects like rulers, inkwells, and slates to fly about the room. Now, Zephaniah tried everything he could to stop the disturbances, although this mostly consisted of him beating and abusing the youngsters. The strange events continued, though. When he realized that he couldn't stop the weird antics, he grew furious. Now, each time the boys fell into a trance, he would berate and verbally abuse them. He would try to rouse them by pinching and slapping them until they were black and blue. Now, once on the advice of the sympathetic Christian friend, he doused the boys with boiling water. When this
sympathetic, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Nice Christian method.
Yeah, really.
When this didn't work, he was allowed this friend to drop a red-hot coal into William's hand. He hoped to exorcise his devils. Now the boy never awakened from his trance, and he bore a scar on his palm for the rest of his life. Now, on occasion, though, the spirits would attempt to defend the boys, appearing in front of Zephaniah and scaring him from the house.
Good.
Now, needless to say, eerie and frustrating happenings were more than the man could stand. So tiring of the boys, but realizing their money-making potential, he sold the Eddy brothers to a traveling showman, who for the next 14 years took them all over America, Canada, and Europe. As part of the performance, he would challenge audiences to try and awaken the boys from their trances. These audiences made their father's abuse look tame. The Eddys were locked into small wooden boxes to see if they could escape, and hot wax was poured into their mouths to see if they could produce spirit voices when they were unable to talk. Now the skeptics poked and prodded and punched the sleeping brothers, leaving them scarred and damaged for the rest of their lives. Now, on several occasions, they were even stoned and shot at by angry mobs. William Eddy bore a number of bullet scars on his body, and according to writer John Mason, they were mobbed in Lynn, Massachusetts, and stoned at South Danvers. On a second trip to Danvers, they were shot at. They were ridden on a rail out of Cleveland and barely escaped a coat of tar and feathers. Wow. So there you go. So you either stay at home and get beaten by your dad and, pour boiling water over your head and here, hold a hot coal, or you can go out on the road and get beat by the public and tarred and feathered. So what a great life.
It makes me wonder, this public was used to seeing people doing lots of stunts and all kinds of acts. What made the public so angry at them?
Well, I think it's because they said that the whole deal was to challenge them if you could wake them up from the trance they were in. And I guess that was the whole paranormal challenge, is if they don't wake up from this trance, then I guess they considered them evil or just mad because they couldn't get them to wake up, so they were going to go tar and feather and beat them. It literally is like a sideshow. It's like a sideshow. It's almost like the Elephant Man. You know what I mean?
So probably the type of crowd that they attracted were probably a bunch of unsavory characters who were used to violence. Who knows?
Oh, yeah, because it said they went all over Europe and stuff too. So I'm sure they went to little villages and towns, and it's the whole sideshow, freak show setup. I mean, what a great way to live.
Right, where people had mob mentality, and if they saw something they didn't like or was different, let's kick their ass. In other words. So,
and if something's different and you challenge it and it doesn't do what you want, it makes you even madder. So, of course, you're going to beat them even more.
Right. And the mother, I wonder what the mother had to say, that the father sold her 2 sons to a circus to do spiritualist acts.
I have no idea. The fact that she went through her whole ordeal and was driven out and relocated somewhere else. She's got to you have to sympathize, you'd think, a little bit, but apparently that's not the case. Or she had little control over what her husband did, I guess.
I think the latter is probably true. She probably had little control because women back then didn't have much of a say in anything, really, including their marriage.
You do what you're told. You do it when you're told.
Exactly. And those boys, I'm sure they regretted even having a gift of any kind.
If they knew the difference, this is normal life to them. Look, their father constantly doing this, them not really understanding what they're able to do and why it would be different or considered a freakish thing if it's normal to them, like playing with kids who people see disappear. To them, playing with the kids is probably normal.
Well, I'm sure it was normal life to them, but but having to produce it in front of people for money.
Yeah, I'm
they
sure
realized there was something different about them, and not everybody did this.
Yeah, that whole ordeal must have been horrible. And they were young then too. This wasn't like they were adults; they were young.
No, what a way to grow up! And they couldn't even go to school because they caused problems in the school.
Exactly. So the question is, were they ever able to go back home? And I think you're going to continue on there.
Right. Well, only after their father died were the boys able to return home. They moved into the family farm with their sister Mary and opened the house as a modest inn called the Green Tavern. And these things were all learned later. On his arrival, Olcott was only able to gain a first impression of the men who were kind of considered unfriendly, the two men. And given their history, I can understand that. They were certainly not the deceitful con men that he had expected. So what were they, according to Olcott? So on Olcott's first day at the farm, he was witness to an outdoor seance. In the bright moonlight of a warm summer evening, a group of 10 participants, they traveled down a path and into a deep ravine, and they assembled in front of a natural cave that were formed by two large stones that had collapsed on top of one another, forming a large arch. That must have been some cave. The cave was called Honto's Cave, which is what Olcott later learned that was the name of it. Mm-hmm. And it was in honor of the Native American spirit who often appeared there. Olcott suspiciously investigated the cave, and no exit could be found in the back of the rocks. And he determined that there was no way that anyone could slip in or out of the cave without being seen. Horatio Eddy, he acted as the medium for the seance. He sat on a camp stool under the arch and then was draped in a makeshift spirit cabinet formed by shawls and branches that had been cut from small saplings. And as Horatio rested there, a gigantic man dressed as a Native American emerged from the darkness of the cave. While the medium addressed this spirit, someone cried out and pointed up towards the top of the cave, and standing there, silhouetted against the moon, was another gigantic Indian. And to the right, another spectral female had materialized on the ledge. So in all, 10 such figures appeared during the seance. And the last, the spirit of William White, the late editor of a spiritualist newspaper, he emerged from within Horatio's cabinet. And he was dressed in a black suit and white shirt, and he was supposedly recognizable to someone who read the newspaper and recognized his picture. So he vanished at the same time the others did, and moments later, Horatio appeared from the cabinet and signaled that the seance was at an end. So after the bizarre display was over, Olcott and Capps, they carefully searched the cave and the surrounding area for footprints, on that they left in the dirt, and they found no trace that anyone had ever been there.
You know what's interesting about this is a lot of back in the spiritualist era, in order for people to believe it, the spirits had to appear in a cabinet or come from a cabinet or go back into a cabinet, some kind of controlled device or enclosure. And I just think it's really odd that I don't know why that would be. If that was a choice by spiritualists, like, okay, in order for anyone to believe anything, it has to come or go into this box that I have designed so that they can look at it maybe before the seance. And if I can materialize something in this box, they'll be amazed. They'll believe what I'm saying. It's just a weird practice to me about these cabinets. And they were very, very common. But
they were very common, but you would think if it's truly somebody from spirit, they don't need a cabinet in order to appear. They can appear from anywhere.
Yeah, there's stuff like that that's the stuff I really have questions about. Like, why do we need cabinets? Why do we need
all of those?
A medium box. Why do we need? It's just, I don't know if it's because people were just more apt to believe things then. Maybe then they would now. Now they've seen a lot. They know magic, what magic is. People know magic tricks. They know illusions. Back then, most people probably didn't know any of that stuff. So I could see it being a reason to disprove so that you can see that it's real. And B, on the flip side, I could also see it being, it has to be in this cabinet so I can control it because it's a hoax. I could see it go either way.
Either way, or it could have they could have set this all up for atmosphere as well. You know what I would like to see? I would like to see an old-fashioned seance where they have all the old instruments they used back then with nobody, with no one touching them, but just to see what happens with an old-fashioned seance with the instruments versus without them. I would like to see that.
You mean like the same group, the same medium, the same situation,
same everything?
Do it in a Victorian spiritual setting, and then do it in a modern day normal setting.
Yes, I'd like to see that. And I don't want everybody to dress up the part or whatever. I don't really need that. Everybody can just come as they are, but but the setting would be with the old Victorian instruments that they use, the cabinet, the trumpet.
Yeah.
And then the second setting, another night without it. And let's see what kind of results you get.
That would be unusual. I would love to see that myself.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. So I'm talking to spiritualists out there. If you would like to set something like that up, I'm up for it.
Yeah, good luck with that. We're here, though. Okay, Olcott found the seance to be convincing, but was sure that he would be able to more easily detect fraud within the controlled setting of the Eddy house. Now, he and Capes thoroughly examined the large circle room, which was located on the second floor of the farmhouse. He drew maps, charts, and diagrams, and took numerous measurements, sure that he would find false panels, secret doors, or hidden passages. Now, however, he found nothing out of the ordinary. He was determined not to give up, though, and he convinced the newspapers to hire men to come to the Chittenden and examine the place. Using carpenters and engineers and consultants, another thorough search was conducted. The experts also found nothing strange, and after this, Olcott and Capes were finally convinced that the walls and floors were solid as they had seemed. Because of this, what Olcott witnessed during the nights that followed became even stranger. Each seance was basically the same. On every night of the week except Sunday, guests and visitors would assemble on wooden benches in the seance room. A platform which had been assembled there was lit only by a kerosene lamp recessed in a barrel. William Eddy, who acted as the primary medium, mounted the platform and entered a small cabinet. A few moments later, soft voices began to whisper in the distance. Often it would be singing accompanied by a spectral music. Musical instruments came to life and soared above the heads of the audience members. Disembodied hands appeared, waving and touching the spectators, and odd lights and unexplained noises appeared and filled the air. Then the first spirit form emerged from the cabinet. They came one at a time or in groups, numbering as many as 20 or 30 in an evening. Some were completely visible and seemed solid, now others were transparent and ethereal. Regardless, they awed the frightened spectators. The spirits ranged in size from over 6 feet tall to very small, and it's worth noting here that William Eddy was only 5 feet 9 inches tall. Most of the ghostly apparitions were elderly Yankees or Native Americans, but many other races and nationalities also appeared in costumes like Africans, Russians, Asians, and more. Where did they come from? Olcott pondered. He examined the spirit cabinet and platform and found no trapdoor or hidden passages. In fact, there was no room in the cabinet for anyone other than the medium himself. Olcott was familiar with the workings of stage magicians and fraudulent mediums, but could find none of their tricks present at the Eddy house. So this kind of goes with what I was just talking about. Like, obviously, there were magicians at the time. This guy, of Olcott, I mean, this is a guy who was in the Civil War. He worked for the government, and his whole job was to debunk fraudulent activity in the government.
Exactly.
So
yeah, and he
being a skeptic was his job. So the
absolutely
fact that he was familiar with stage magicians and frauds and still couldn't figure out any of the tricks in the Eddy house is an interesting one, I think.
At the same time, it sounds like such a elaborate theater show that, I mean, if I were sitting there and I were watching that, I don't know, I would probably be giggling in the middle of this seance.
Well, I think today, if someone was touching me and I saw hands and they were moving around and clapping and waving, and I saw like musical instruments playing above me, and I would probably giggle and laugh too. They would be amusing to me. But to them,
they would kick me out. I'd be laughing too much.
Exactly. To them, I guess it's shocking and amazing and frightening to some of them. But to me, the description of all that stuff together combined sounds very fraudulent to me. It sounds like people, who knows if they had, I don't know what they would use, whether it's gloves or, the instruments and strings. It all sounds so cliche because you hear so many different seances and they're all using the same instruments and the same techniques. You're like, if this is really the spiritual connection, why would all these seances have the same components? Musical instruments, hands, faces, loved
different
ones.
nationalities and costumes. And
yeah, I remember we talked about Native Americans at that time were more prominent because obviously
we did a show about that. Yeah,
we were still doing wars with the Native Americans taking their land, so they were going to be more prominent and current. It just, I don't know. That brings up my skepticism when I hear that kind of stuff. But, I wasn't there. I can't say yes or no, right?
Right. And think about it this way also. People's lives were different back then.
Mm-hmm.
The whole world, the whole atmosphere of most people's lives were very quiet.
Yeah.
There was no radio. There was no TV, no distractions.
Yep.
If you wanted to hear noise or music, you had to go to a concert or a theater show, or you had to play an instrument or knew somebody who did.
Yeah.
And most of the time, you didn't witness anything that was out of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wanted to prove spiritualism or the spirit world, you actually went to what was available.
Well, that's just it. You have authors, you have traveling mediums. That these would be the shows that we would see Houdini and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle go with, presenting mediums into different towns on a tour. That's how these people experience this, and they would never see anything like this in their lives. So I could see where the wonderment of discovery, along with frightening, oh my God, this is a ghost, these are spirits, to what's happening before them, all combined creates a very overwhelming experience. Whether it's completely factual or not, that's another question.
Now, here's another aspect to this that a lot of people don't think about, but I think about it because of my antique book collection. Sometimes there will be articles from spirit newspapers stuck in these books, and there's remember I showed you one, from a paper called the Spirit Diamond.
Exactly.
And the real spiritualists, the real people who actually went to the spiritualist church and they practiced it as a spiritual belief to better their lives, did not do this type of show where they did it for money and they had this elaborate theater seance. They didn't work it out that way. They had private sittings. They actually try to counsel people and do good for the community.
Uh-huh.
So the serious spiritualists did not do that.
Yeah,
Most of them.
That's why I think when the spiritualists had started, I think they were hijacked by the swindlers and the con artists and the carnival sideshows. Mm-hmm. So everyone and their mama were like, hey, if I claim I'm a medium, I could go on the road and pretend I'm talking to their dead relatives. And the more people did that, the more all these frauds happened, the more it made no wonder the spiritualists and like Lily Dale went and said, you know what, we're going to start our own community and we're going to cut ourselves off.
And it was very necessary. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like, we're tired of that. We don't want to associate in any way with that because it's fraudulent. Let's have our own community upstate New York where nobody can, we control what goes on there.
Right. And as a result, today I want to go visit Lily Dale. I've always wanted to visit there. But I want to talk about something to do with this story here.
Let's
Honto's Cave.
Do you want to just
Honto's Cave is still open.
Do you want to finish the story first?
Yes. Now the apparitions, they not only appeared, but they also performed, sang, and chatted with the sitters. So they actually interacted with the audience. They also produced spirit articles like musical instruments, clothing, and scarves. And nearly every type of phenomena was reported at the Eddy farmhouse. So those included rappings, moving physical objects, spirit paintings, automatic writing, prophecy, speaking in tongues, healings, unseen voices, levitation, remote visions, teleportation, and more of that. So, of course, the full body manifestations of which Olcott observed more than 400, which were more than 400 during the weeks he visited the house. That's a lot, actually.
That's a whole lot.
He concluded, yeah, that's quite a lot. Now, he concluded that a show like that, which he have seen, would have required an entire company of actors and several trunks of costumes. But his inspection of the premises revealed no place to hide either actors or props. And the ideal of stage actors was further dispelled by the convincing manner of the spirits. One woman spoke in Russian to the alleged spirit of her deceased husband. Another of other dialects were also heard. How is this possible when the Eddys could barely read and write and were scarcely capable of speaking coherent English?
That's an important fact right there, because if they were illiterate, both of them, that's an interesting fact right there, is how were they able to do that?
Exactly. And people back then didn't travel very widely, and they weren't worldly back then. Most people only knew what they knew from their communities back then.
Yep.
Yeah. And what I think is that I think that a little bit of real spiritual abilities could have been mixed in along with the theatrical aspect. So there could have been some real, if they were actually naturally clairvoyant, some of the real spiritualism could have actually mixed in with this.
Well, we've talked about this before, where I think it was the Fox sisters might have had some real latent ability that obviously mom decided, let's exploit this. And I think that's the problem, is they see a little bit of ability and they think, oh, if my son or daughter is gifted, we could go on the road and be as famous as all those other spiritualists we know about. And I think that's what happens, is it starts to turn the real ability into a carnival sideshow, and then they're expected to do stuff on command. And I think that's where it goes south, is that people think, oh, they're completely, utterly a fraud because they couldn't do it. In fact, we found evidence of fraud doing this and that. When that could be the case, but that doesn't necessarily mean what they started out with was the fraud.
Exactly. In addition, such an elaborate show would have cost a fortune to produce every night. They would have had to pay actors. They would have had to invest in costumes and hire someone to create all of the marbles that the show entailed. So this would have been impossible, given that the brothers were almost penniless. Most of the visitors who came to the farm, they didn't pay, and the rest only gave $8 per week for room and board at the inn. So no admission was ever charged for the seances. So in Olcott's mind, fraud would have been physically and financially impossible. The investigator's 10-week stay on the Eddy farm was a test of endurance. He left not liking the house, the food, and the weather, and he didn't like the Eddy brothers either. So, however, he was convinced, though, of the fact that the two men could actually make contact with the dead.
Okay, now, not only did Colonel Olcott chronicle his visit to the newspaper, he also wrote a massive book called People from Other Worlds. Now, the book, over 500 pages long, is a full and precise drawings of apparitions, the grounds, the house, even detailed plans of the construction, proving that no hidden passages existed. Now, drawings were done by Olcott of cross-sections of the spirit cabinet, and according to his account, he was unable to find any fraud to explain the bizarre manifestations. And he also recorded over 400 different supernatural beings and collected hundreds of affidavits and scores of eyewitness testimonies to the amazing events. He also produced dozens of statements from respected tradesmen and carpenters who examined the house for trickery. A modern reader would have to look very hard to discover anything that Olcott did not investigate. And eventually, the Eddy brothers and Sister Mary went their separate ways. Their bickering and feuding had driven them apart. Horatio moved out and took a house across the road, where he took up light gardening, occasional seances, and doing magic tricks for local children. Mary moved to a nearby village of East Pittsford, where she became a full-time professional medium. William dropped out of public life altogether and became a bitter recluse on the family farm. Now, the first of the Eddys to die was Horatio on September 8th, 1922. William lived for another 10 years. He never married and refused to ever participate in spiritualism again. He died on October 25th, 1932, at the age of 99. If either of the men had any secrets about the weird events at their home, they took the secrets with them to their grave. So what really happened on the Eddy farm in Chittenden, Vermont? To read it today, we are first inclined to dismiss the events as fanciful tales from another time, but can we really do that? The credentials of Olcott prohibit us from dismissing the story. His extensive documentation and investigative skills suggest the events were not part of a hoax. Alcott remained skeptical and analytical throughout his 10-week stay at the farm, and yet he came away convinced that the Eddys had the power to contact and communicate with the dead. Colonel Alcott came away from Chittenden a believer. So that's interesting.
Well, that is interesting. I want to find that book, actually. But, you know, there is actually a museum site from Vermont that's dedicated to the Eddy brothers.
Really?
And, yeah, there is. And they talk about the family. They do lectures. And the property where the cave is located is actually a private property that a family owns now. And they say on the website that if you want to visit it, you have to ask the family first, because that part of their property gets a lot of publicity. And they tell people not to go there unless you talk to them first, out of respect for them.
Interesting.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a lot of leftover energy to investigate in that place.
It's possible.
I'd love to visit and see and take a look at the place.
Yeah, like you said, I would love to investigate the property and whatever buildings are on the property that were where the farm, unless the farmhouse is still there. I doubt it. Mm-hmm. But you never know.
It's interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting about that the spotlight is usually on the two brothers, but their sister actually became a professional medium. So she was she had the abilities too, but nobody really talks much about her. Yeah.
It's interesting how they went their separate ways, but they continued to do some of the same stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting.
I would have thought that they would have wanted to forget about it once they settle on their farm, and you know, they got beaten up and things thrown at them traveling, but well, maybe they got over it and they decided that it was worth earning money from. So
now you were talking about,
even though they didn't earn much, but they didn't earn much though.
You were talking about Honto's Cave, correct?
Honto's Cave, correct.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
You were starting to talk about that before we continued on. I know I just found a thing that says Honto's Cave is located on private land and the homeowners are not allowing anyone on the property without permission from them directly. Mm-hmm. Ironically enough, which I thought was interesting.
I'm surprised nobody's tried to investigate that yet or got permission to do it.
Nope, I guess not.
No. That would be a very interesting place to investigate, but only if the owners are okay with that. Of course.
I would love that.
Yeah, I would love it too. Yeah.
Set that up for us, Verna.
Yeah. Well, sure. If I knew where to contact them.
Yeah, exactly. All right, folks, that's another episode of Ecto Portal, another journey into the spiritualism of the Victorian era, which I'm sure we'll find many more. We've seen a lot of similarities, some differences as far as abilities go, and just the way things are handled and treated by the people around them. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to compare these kind of stories back to back with other ones that we find, just to see where they differ, where they're the same, where some of the reactions are the same. But it's interesting nonetheless, as we obviously are ongoing fascination, discovery of spiritualism in the Victorian era.
Yeah, very interesting era. The more I read about it, the more I want to find out more.
Yep. Yeah. All right, folks. Until next week, we'll see you later. Bye.
See you next week. Bye.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.